Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to you all. Welcome to the Impact webinar From Vision to Action, Realizing the Potential of Hydrogen Through Concrete Developments. My name is Molly Huang, Head of Content at Leader Associates, and it's my great honor to be your host for today's session. The global hydrogen industry is filled with mixed feelings, hopes and doubts, excitement and uncertainty. Yet one thing is clear: hydrogen is crucial for our future energy needs. In today's webinar, we aim to move beyond traditional narrative of hope versus hype, but explore the real state of hydrogen through insights from leaders who are driving changes. Our discussion will cover important advancements in policy, projects, and technology, with a keen focus on substantial markets such as Scotland and Denmark, as well as successful business demos made by H2 Green Steel, Uniper, CWP, and Hyphen Hydrogen. Against the backdrop of IRA, we will also hear about progress in the US market featured by 8 Rivers. Our goal is for you to leave with a true understanding of the industry progress, inspiring confidence, and providing actionable insights into the future. This webinar is a prelude to the highly anticipated Investing in Green Hydrogen 2024, the global summit uniting the world's hydrogen visionaries. Taking place in London, UK on September the 2nd and 3rd, it offers an amazing opportunity to meet over 800 C-level decision makers, including regulators, hydrogen developers, investors, off-takers, and suppliers from across 55 countries. Before we start, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared online. We encourage active participation in the Q&A box following each of the presentations. And now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our opening speaker, Mr. Ivan Popovi, Hydrogen Regulation and International Engagement Team Lead at the Scottish Government. Welcome, Mr. Popovi. The stage is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today with everyone in attendance to give an overview of some of the work that the Scottish Government has been doing over the last years in the hydrogen space, since particularly the publication of the Hydrogen Action Plan. I'm just trying to share my screen. While that is set up, I'll just say that I have been working for the Scottish Government and in the Hydrogen Policy Unit for the last 5 years, which have been 5 years full of activity in the hydrogen space, as we'll be able to go through on the slides, which I think should be now ready for everyone, but please let me know if that's not the case. So I'll start by setting off the background. In Scotland, we have strict climate change targets that aim to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045, with a 75% reduction by 2030 against the 1990 baseline. To achieve this, it's clear that we need to move at an unprecedented pace across our whole economy to deliver the innovation, the investment, and regulations that will enable a move to net zero. And to achieve this, Scotland needs to move at that unprecedented level and utilize what we have in terms of skill, offshore engineering heritage, an extensive network of ports and strong innovation clusters. Scotland can be at the heart of Europe's energy transition and support energy security for decades to come. And some of the ingredients that Scotland has to ensure that that's the case include abundant natural resources, an experienced energy workforce, and experience exporting energy, skilled energy supply chains, research and innovation expertise, and a supportive policy environment, which I will be talking about a little bit of today. And in this context, it is clear that hydrogen will play an important role in transitioning many hard-to-abate sectors to net zero. Hydrogen, along offshore wind, has been highlighted across many of our policies as one of Scotland's biggest economic opportunities in the decades to come. The hydrogen opportunity is particularly considerable in Scotland due to our huge potential pipeline for renewable energy generation. subject to planning and consenting decisions and finding a route to market, we have a reported potential pipeline of over 38 gigawatts of offshore wind projects on top of 2.2 gigawatts, which is currently operational. This means that Scotland currently has a total potential offshore wind capacity of over 40 gigawatts, the equivalent of producing enough electricity annually to power every home in Scotland for 17 years or every home in the UK for over a year and a half. In addition to this, we also have an ambition of 20 gigawatts of installed capacity for onshore wind by 2030 and the potential for growth in marine and solar capacity. An example of this, for instance, you have it in the Orkney Islands, where, for example, we had the first hydrogen produced from tidal energy in the world. Our renewable generation potential is such that our assessments highlight that where the hydrogen potential uh, is to be fully developed, Scotland will be able to produce industrial scale quantities of renewable hydrogen for both domestic use as well as for export to the wider UK and overseas. Scotland continues to generate more electricity than it needs, with net exports of electricity to other UK nations in 2023 amounting to 15.9 terawatt hours. Hydrogen, therefore, represents not just an option for emissions reductions opportunities for our own use in the transition to net zero, but also an economic opportunity by exporting surplus hydrogen to support the requirements of our neighbors across the north of Europe. And for this reason, over the last 4 years, we have been building our evidence base within the hydrogen team and developing our hydrogen policies, which culminated in the publication of two key documents. One of these is our hydrogen policy statement, and the other one is the hydrogen action plan, which was published in December 2022, and which I will go into a little bit more detail today. In the hydrogen action plan, as well as in the policy statement, we set up a strong support for the development of a hydrogen economy in Scotland. We set out the role that we think hydrogen can play in helping decarbonize key sectors of our economy, such as industrial heat and heavy transport, and the role Scotland can play as an exporter of hydrogen to our neighboring countries in Northern Europe and as well as in the wider UK. The vision set up in this documents is for Scotland to produce 5 gigawatts of renewable and low carbon hydrogen by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045, given potential to provide up to 32 terawatt hours per annum for domestic use by 2045 and 94 terawatts hour of green hydrogen per annum for export by 2045. The focus of this document is on renewable hydrogen, based obviously on the extensive renewable generation capacity that Scotland has, but there's also support within this document for low carbon hydrogen production when this is linked to CCUS, particularly as a transitional opportunity. The Hydrogen Action Plan sets out hence how the Scottish Government will develop its strategic approach and actions to help Scotland become what we call a hydrogen leading nation. The action plan is themed around 33 actions in 6 key areas that will help us reach our ambition to reach those 5 gigawatts of production capacity by 2030 and 25 by 2045. Some of these themes include scaling up production, increasing domestic uptake and integration into the wider energy system, enabling the transition of our workforce and supply chains, strengthening research and innovation, but also very importantly, linking up with international partners to play a key role in the global hydrogen market. The action plan is also very fixated in supporting the development of regional hydrogen energy hubs across Scotland to bring together production, distribution, and use at the regional level. The plan is supported by a program of capital funding designed to accelerate and maximize the production of renewable hydrogen in Scotland. To this date, funding includes the launch in 2022 of our Hydrogen Innovation Scheme, which was our first tranche of hydrogen investment, which granted which offer grants totaling almost 7 million to 31 projects that will drive innovation in renewable hydrogen production, storage, and distribution. We are now assessing how we can continue to support R&D in the Scottish hydrogen sector. And on the left of the slide, you can see some of the various key developments that we see taking place in Scotland on our route to net zero and 25 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2045. But where are we now? So, guided by our Hydrogen Action Plan, which was published nearly 2 years ago, we have been working collaboratively with the energy sector to drive progress over the course of this Parliament. A hydrogen program has been established to coordinate work across the Scottish Government with our enterprise agencies and inject pace into the delivery of the action plan. Uh, to this date, there are almost 100 projects considering the production of hydrogen in Scotland in varying stages of development. And and that's a big if they are all delivered, total project capacity would exceed 13 gigawatts by 2032. And so Scotland is at this stage well on track to exceed that policy ambition to have 5 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. However, many projects will need Scottish Government funding to complete development stages and maximize opportunities of successfully securing funding, such as the one provided by the UK Government through their business models. Um, Almost half of the known projects are still confidential, and we are engaging with these projects to understand and help address any issues and barriers that they might be encountering um, as they finalize their site selection, their offtake agreements, electricity connections, and other challenges. These projects must secure offtake agreements, grid connections, and planning consents to access some of the funding available, such as the UK government's hydrogen business model, hydrogen allocation rounds, which I've just mentioned. And to support these projects, we are taking action to improve the hydrogen planning and consenting regimes, mapping offtake across sectors, and matchmaking production projects with off-takers, as well as engaging with the energy operators on actions on hydrogen production, grid transmission, connection delays, and incentives for hydrogen production to provide grid balancing services and reduce grid constraints. In terms of blue hydrogen projects, there are fewer than obviously green hydrogen projects, and these are intrinsically linked to the successful development of Scottish clusters within the UK government CCUS clusters sequencing program. However, blue hydrogen projects represent a total potential of 1.8 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by the end of the decade, so they're really critical to our energy transition. Most of these projects are also clustered around industrial areas such as the ones in the northeast and Grangemouth and Fife. In this map over here, you can see from that list of 93 total hydrogen projects, the ones that have been announced already, which is 52 projects in Scotland. These projects are at different stages of development, and we expect them to continue progressing over the next year as they agree on offtake agreements, uh, get grid connections and other challenges and issues necessary for them to reach a final investment decision. And the bubbles on this map correspond to the size of all of these projects. And you can clearly see that many of these are developing around the northeast of Scotland, areas where there's high renewal capacity. But the opportunity for Scotland within the developing hydrogen market is significant, but it surpasses our borders. As previously mentioned, we want Scotland to realize economic benefits from export of hydrogen and hydrogen-based products, such as sustainable aviation fuel, e-ammonia, or e-methanol, um, both to the rest of the UK as well as to the north of Europe. We also want to establish Scotland as the centre of a hub and spoke model for the transportation of green hydrogen from Scotland and Ireland to Europe, connecting via hydrogen pipeline infrastructure, which will be the most cost competitive and low cost hydrogen uh, mean to ensure imports. We want a thriving domestic hydrogen sector and hydrogen production for export, supported by a strong supply chain that supports a just transition and captures significant long-term economic benefits. This means that we'll have to attract inward investment, securing and creating jobs along the hydrogen value chain, and ensuring that large-scale manufacturing opportunities from Scotland-derived products such as fertilizers are materialized. This is why we are currently working to develop a hydrogen sector export plan, which will outline how the Scottish Government will use its trade and investment levers to support the development of an international market for Scotland's hydrogen sector, in turn enabling businesses to capitalize on export opportunities across the Scottish hydrogen value chain. To achieve this, however, it is also essential that Scotland builds strong working relationships with key export partners and that we identify opportunities, share knowledge and best practice progress with to assess the materialization of our export aspirations. We aim to develop strong working relationships with key export partners, and we are already having developing a very strong cooperation agreements with regions across Germany, as well as elsewhere in the north of Europe. As I said, it is essential that Scotland builds strong working relationships with key export partners, and that we identify the opportunities and share that knowledge and best practices. This is one of the key areas that we have been prioritizing since the publication of the action plan. There is still much more to do than what has already been done, um, but we aim to continue to participate actively in international hydrogen cooperation forums such as Hydrogen Europe and the Vanguard Initiative, European Regions Research and Innovation Networks, and other large multinational forums. Um, these forums enable us to work with stakeholders across regions, share knowledge, lessons, and join up innovation assets and identify joint projects and funding opportunities. We have also been progressing memorandum of understandings and cooperation agreements with partners such as German states, Occitania, and Denmark, with whom we have signed hydrogen-specific collaboration agreements. Um, we recognize that international cooperation will be a key to developing future hydrogen markets and their support and infrastructure, and we will continue to seek these collaboration opportunities. Like I said, we're very keen to develop this as partnerships, exploring new ones, and this will be one of the key actions that we will take forward over the coming years as, as established through our action plan, as well as the forthcoming hydrogen sector export plan. But alongside our domestic network and the work that we're doing, reaching out to international partners, we also need to ensure that the infrastructure is ready for the growth of the sector. And we have been working with ports and terminals in Scotland to ensure that these uh, are ready. And the Scottish and the UK governments, for instance, have joined developed a green freeport model that offers specific tax benefits on designated sites to new economic activity to promote regeneration, innovation, decarbonization, and encourage global trade and investment. In Scotland, the port of Inverness and Cromarty Firth, as well as the fourth Green Freeport, have both been jointly selected by the Scottish and the UK governments to become Scotland's first green freeports. These ports will support businesses to create high quality, well paid new jobs, promote growth and regeneration, and make significant contributions to achieve our net zero ambitions, including in the development of hydrogen opportunities. At the same time, we're also establishing um, cooperation, and we're working with ports such as the one from the ports of Rotterdam, Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven, and Antwerp in the north of Europe to ensure that there is an understanding of the required export infrastructure and that this is compatible for the future export of hydrogen between Scotland and the north of Europe. Additionally, our proximity and existing infrastructure connectivity to Europe makes transporting gaseous hydrogen by pipeline a cost-competitive option. And to this end, we have been funding the Scottish Net Zero Technology Centre in Aberdeen to take forward the Hydrogen Backbone Link project. This project is assessing the potential to connect Scotland to the European hydrogen backbone through the north of Europe by either repurposing and optimizing existing pipeline infrastructure or developing new pipelines. This project has already highlighted that developing new pipelines linking the hydrogen hubs of St Fergus, Port of Cromarty, Flota and Shetland could reduce transportation costs to 32 pence per kilogram of hydrogen. Such anticipated transportation costs could make the cost of delivered green hydrogen produced in Scotland internationally cost competitive. The research report from the Hydrogen Backbone Link project suggests that €3 per kilogram to the EU customers, as opposed to 3.1 kilograms from the Middle East, North Africa, or Chile, could be possible. Through phase 2 of the Hydrogen Backbone Link project, we are now assessing the hydrogen pipeline option for Scotland and the requirements to deliver a hydrogen backbone link at scale. Additionally, during phase 2, the project will be looking at investigating hydrogen import links from the Irish sector in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to Scotland. This section of the hydrogen backbone link will consider how hydrogen pipeline network could be established between the two countries and facilitate the cost-effective, safe and secure future of Europe's energy needs. However, one of the most important tasks that we need to take forward as a government is to establish a regulatory framework for hydrogen development, that this is responsive and that this supports the scale up of hydrogen at pace whilst protecting the environment and our communities. For this, we are working collaboratively with the UK government to develop a shared vision that supports Scottish hydrogen objectives. And the levers reserved to the UK government, particularly with regards to the build out of hydrogen infrastructure and trade negotiations, as well as regulatory frameworks and standards and trade promotions, are critical to ensure that Scottish companies can benefit from global markets and opportunities. And to this end, we have established a Scottish Regulators Steering Group that is assisting us in identifying regulatory gaps and develop action to ensure that we have a regulatory level field that can support the growth of the sector. On standards and certifications, we're also working with the UK government in the development of the low carbon hydrogen standard and certification scheme. And we are doing so, trying to ensure that it enables exports and does not create barriers to hydrogen export between the UK and the EU. That was an overview of some of the work that we have been doing on the hydrogen space and the hydrogen policy space from the Scottish Government. Many of the documents I have been referencing during this presentation are linked in here, and the presentation slides should be shared with all the attendees. So please feel free to access these documents and see with a little bit more detail than what I was able to go through in 15 minutes, some of the work that we have been doing on this front. That's all from me in terms of the presentation. I'm more than happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kapoy, for sharing such a wonderful presentation on the Scotland's latest achievements and plans in the hydrogen sector. We can certainly see a growing ecosystem forming in the Scotland, and there are much more expectation forward. And here we've also got some very interesting questions for you. And the first one is, will Scotland offer more incentives to new green technology developers, not limited to electrolyzers, but also players across the value chain?
Yeah, so as I mentioned during the presentation, we want a thriving domestic hydrogen sector that is able to produce hydrogen for domestic use as well as for export. And this needs to be supported by a strong supply chain. This will mean attracting inward investment, securing and creating jobs along the full hydrogen value chain, as well as supporting large-scale manufacturing opportunities for hydrogen in Scotland, both for hydrogen as well as for hydrogen products such as fertilizers or e-fuel. So we're taking a network approach to supporting the full value chain in Scotland. We are working with our enterprise agencies and industry bodies such as Hydrogen Scotland to help companies transition from existing sectors, connect them with each other, identifying gaps and benefits from linking to inward investment and so on. We take as well a program approach across this Team Scotland that we've developed with the enterprise agencies that we aimed at to bring together actors across the whole sector, including production, demand, supply chain, infrastructure, but as well as skills and investments. So some of our work has been and will be focused over the coming years in ensuring that the right connections can be established, that we identify the current challenges to the development of the sector in Scotland, that we facilitate as much as we can the planning system so that hydrogen projects can flourish. In terms of investment programs, over the last couple of years, we've been focusing on research and innovation investment, and I've mentioned before some of the work that we've done to support that through our hydrogen innovation scheme. Over the coming years, we will be working with our enterprise agencies to continue to assess further means by which support the sector, both at R&D stage, but also in terms of capital investment.
Yes. The second question is more about project type. Given Scotland's strong offshore wind resources, will there be policy support for offshore hydrogen projects particularly?
Yeah, well, so it's clear that offshore wind generation is the main reason why Scotland can be an importer and produce an important producer and exporter of hydrogen. Like I said before, already in 2020, renewable electricity generation had risen up to 98% of Scotland's gross electricity consumption. So this is before much of the offshore wind development is deployed in the Scottish offshore. So we are engaging closely with offshore wind developers who have an interest in hydrogen production. So we have established a Scottish Hydrogen Industry Forum, which is chaired by our minister, Ms. Martin, who spoke last year and will speak later this year at your conference in London, to take forward discussions with developers, understand what the current challenges are. We're also using the Nesio Technology Centre, who we funded to engage with offshore wind developers who are interested in producing green hydrogen in Scotland and providing advice through research on some of the key challenges and barriers that offshore projects might be facing. We're also considering considering and looking to work with industry to ensure that the strategic investment model, which is a model that unlocks infrastructure investment into offshore wind ports and harbors, critical infrastructure and supply chain, also considers the alignment and future integration of hydrogen infrastructure with offshore wind infrastructure in ports and harbors. Deploying this key infrastructure is crucial to ensure that offshore wind developers can continue bidding for future offshore wind leasing rounds in Scotland and find a route to market by including hydrogen in their business case.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Kapui, for your detailed answer. As the time is ticking, I will have to stop you here, but I believe the audience are very much look forward to engage in Scotland's hydrogen plan, and thank you once again for sharing the insights with us. As you can see, there are also questions waiting in the Q&A box. I would appreciate if you can stay longer to answer them. There's one from Aidan Leah.
Thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And now please join me to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Andre Colbert, advisor of Danish Energy Agency, to present the Denmark's latest P2X plan. and how it facilitates the landing of a concrete hydrogen economy. Welcome on stage, Dr. Colbert.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. I think my camera is still off.
Yes, it would be great if you could on.
All right. And I'm sharing my screen now. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Andre David Korberg, and I'm an advisor at the Danish Energy Agency. And today I'm going to talk about our developments on the hydrogen side and the so-called Power-to-X. And I'll talk about the Power-to-X strategy and our Power-to-X tender.
Yes.
As an introduction.
Yes, to Andre, sorry to interrupt. So your camera is off or is in. Do you need to confirm your video state?
Let's try again.
Yes, please. Thank you. Yes,
Is it better now?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Let's continue. I just wanted to say a few words about the Danish Energy Agency because I think it's important to know the Danish Energy Agency is one of the agencies under the Ministry of Energy, Climate and Utilities in Denmark. And we handle essentially everything that concerns the energy supply and the energy sector in Denmark. Among others, the Power-to-X strategy and the Power-to-X work is handled also by the Danish Energy Agency. I have an agenda for you today. I will say a few words about the Power-to-X strategy, but also go into more details about the Power-to-X tender, which is actually the most interesting for today. We also had in Denmark an offshore wind tender, a pretty large one. I think it's also worth mentioning, as well as some description of the plans for the hydrogen infrastructure and also about our Power-to-X projects. However, you hear about Power-to-X and what is it? Because it's not a term we normally encounter in other countries. As we saw from Scotland, we hear about hydrogen. Well, Power-to-X, it's also about hydrogen. It's just that we call it Power-to-X, being X being any kind of fuel. Because in Denmark, we imagine hydrogen in the future as being any fuel, but also an intermediate product towards other fuels such as ammonia or methanol for shipping sector, or it can also be e-kerosene for aviation, or it can be another chemical for the chemical industry. We also envision that hydrogen can be used potentially, it's probably in smaller amounts for some types of road transport or for industry. But very importantly, in Denmark, we assume that the future hydrogen production will be just green, only green hydrogen, meaning from renewable energy. Another link I would like to mention from this figure is this integrated approach, where, for example, we can use the heating for the electrolysis to produce the waste heat from electrolysis to produce heating for the district heating system, because we have a pretty large district heating network in Denmark. As part of the agreement for the Power-to-X and for hydrogen in Denmark, there are some very important key elements that I would like to go through. So we have a target in Denmark of 4 to 6 gigawatts of electrolysis by 2030. We also had a tender that took place last year with 5 winners. I'll say more about that in a few moments. But we also imagine, as part of this strategy, the potential having these direct connections between renewable energy production and consumption, as well as geographically differentiated electricity tariffs, meaning that in the future, where in the areas which are more production focused, there will be probably lower tariffs for Power-to-X, and in this case for transporting electricity, than in areas which are governed by higher demands, such as around Copenhagen. As part of the agreement, we also established a Power-to-X task force, which is actually most of it is sitting here in the Danish Energy Agency. And we also took the first steps towards establishing a hydrogen pipeline towards Germany. But let's take first the Power-to-X tender. So what is the role of this Power-to-X tender and why it's happening? Well, it's clear that it's to support the industrialization and upscaling of Power-to-X and support the green transition. We have a budget of 1.3 billion Danish crowns, which is around 177 million euros. And of course, being a tender is competition based, where the lowest bidder wins. We also had some overall bidding caps for the tender, which actually were not reached, fortunately. And the support is given will be given as a fixed price per gigajoule of produced hydrogen for a period of 10 years after the commissioning of the Power-to-X plants. As a timeline, well, it all started with a new climate agreement in 2020. Which established that there should be some kind of Power-to-X strategy in Denmark. And later, the next year in December, we published the Power-to-X strategy. The year after, in March 2022, we had a political agreement about establishing a Power-to-X tender, whilst throughout the 2022, we had meetings with the industry to develop and design this tender. The next year, we received the support from the EU for the support for the tender. Whilst later the same year, in March 2023, we finalized the tender conditions, so we can open the Power-to-X tender the month after. The Power-to-X tender was open for 4 months approximately, and by October and until November, we managed to reach a conclusion from the tender and select the winners to have the contract signed last year in December. So that means that we are pretty much on the way with the work on Power-to-X. Here are the actual winners and some of the support they received from or they will be receiving from the Danish state as part of this tender. What you can see here is only the support per euro of gigajoule of hydrogen, because support is given per gigajoule of hydrogen, not per other fuel that is produced. It can be, in this case, some producers are having methane or methanol as an end fuel. However, the support is given per produced hydrogen. The actual the full price of the production price for hydrogen is not public, but we can show that what is the level of support from the Danish government. As part of this tender, we also required the participants to make sure there's also a flexibility requirement, meaning that maximum 5,500 full load hours can be used for the production of hydrogen. And of course, as I said, the lowest bids within these restrictions have managed to win. Full production should happen within 4 years, meaning that at the end of 2027, we should have the first operating Power-to-X plants, at least the ones you can see here from this table, producing already hydrogen or methane or methanol. For your easier understanding, I also have here a slide with some of the support in euros per kilogram of hydrogen, which is more of a usual unit of calculating the price of hydrogen. As you can see, the support is between 0.6 euros and a little over 1 euro per kilogram of hydrogen. Depending also on the project, on the type of fuel produced at the end, and so on, many other considerations. I also mentioned the offshore wind tender. I think it's very important to include this in this presentation because, well, electrolysis needs a electricity source, and that would be in this case primarily offshore wind. So we opened a tender in April this year for a number of projects that can be in total 6 gigawatts, and all projects should be operational by the end of 2030. As with much of the public infrastructure in Denmark, there will be a state ownership as well for this, but there won't be any subsidies. So everything will be built at the market price. The state guarantees grid connection and also expects that most of this capacity will be used in the future for hydrogen production. We also tightened to a large extent some of the sustainability requirements, going essentially from environmental to sustainability requirements now, meaning that there's a requirement for blades recyclability, higher LCA calculations, social responsibility, for example, in terms of like employment requirements. Yeah, and also there's a possibility for overplanting wind in the areas, so it can go beyond the 6 gigawatts. Yeah, and just as a reference, I can also see in this slide that today Denmark has around 2.7 gigawatts of offshore wind. So with the added 6 gigawatts, there will be a lot of offshore wind in Denmark if this project will take shape. And this will definitely go towards new consumers, in particular Power-to-X and hydrogen. As part of the Power-to-X strategy, there's also a plan to develop a hydrogen infrastructure, and essentially this will have the role to separate the production and demand, but also link the export and the storages and so on. But in other words, it can also support the flexibility, since, well, the production from wind is fluctuant. We essentially had just yesterday a new publication from our TSO, Energinet, with more details about the future pipeline. And we do know right now, and we can say that we're looking at around 360 kilometers of pipeline connecting almost the north of Denmark to Germany, which involves both a reconverted power plant from natural gas and also a new pipeline, which will be the bigger part, and we connect the important parts of Denmark that will be involved in the production of hydrogen. As part of this development for the pipeline, we also have a potential agreement on how the pipeline will be financed and will be built. For example, the proposal right now is that the industry must commit to buying enough capacity before the state can guarantee building this pipe. However, our TSO is currently investigating what are the market needs and if the players can actually commit to buying such capacity, because you can say that it's also a chicken and an egg issue. And depending on like if the state builds the pipeline, then there'll be the off takers for hydrogen, or the other way around. So this is something that is still in discussion. Yes, in regards to the Power-to-X projects, we have a lot of projects currently in Denmark. As you can remember from a previous slide, we envisioned 4.4 to 6 gigawatts of capacity for Power-to-X in Denmark. As it looks right now, we have around 35 projects with approximately 9.5 gigawatts of capacity in the future. And this is just a momentary capture. It can be more, can be less. And here you can see some examples from these projects and the distribution throughout the country. Most of the hydrogen, most of the production would be towards hydrogen, and that will be feeding into the pipeline. At least that is the plan. But there will also be production of methanol, production of ammonia, or kerosene. So there is an interest on all fuels, I would say, but mostly hydrogen in this sense. Yes. What's next? Well, next steps will be to build the plants. So we have a deadline on the December 15, 2027 for building and showing the full capacity of electrolysis for these plants. And yeah, the work on this field is still continuing. We have this the Danish Power-to-X task force with the Danish Power-to-X Secretariat, which is sitting in this building. We also have the development of this hydrogen backbone that one I showed you in a previous slide. But the work is also in establishing this Power-to-X plans, developing a regulatory guide, but also will there be enough electricity? What will be the access to water for the production of these fuels and so on? So the work is underway and it's progressing at a fast pace. That was all from my side. I hope I stuck between the 15 minutes, and I'm happy to answer some questions if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew, for being a great timekeeper, and thank you for your enlightening speech and illustration of the Danish P2X plan. And here we've also got some interesting questions for you. And the number one is, have any of the 5 winning projects reached FID yet? If not, what is the holdup since subsidy contracts signed in December? I think the underlying questions to you, perhaps, what are the biggest stumbling block preventing hydrogen from being a viable option for clean energy? If you can answer both the question, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, as far as I know, the projects are fairly advanced and they have received the final investment decision since everything should be already operational now in less than 4 years. The biggest hurdles for developing hydrogen, I think it's getting to a price for hydrogen or for this Power-to-X fuel that is competitive. That is the hardest part, and with the current issues with inflation and higher costs with raw materials, it is something that is hard to get to. And it's not seen just for the Power-to-X plants, but also for the offshore wind industry, which is also struggles with higher prices. So I would say reaching a competitive price for hydrogen that can compete on international markets is probably the hardest part to get to, because we seem to have, at least from a governmental point of view, we do our best to support the Power-to-X producers in Denmark.
Yes, and the second question is, what are the anticipated impacts of P2X plan on energy markets and consumers? And if I can also add one more, in terms of P in P2X, you mentioned some of the final products, but what do you think will be the most preferred final product in both near term and long term?
Let me start with your second question, here I can say that well, it's hard to say actually which one would be the preferred product in the future. As we can see right now, there's a large development on the hydrogen backbone, not just in Denmark but also across Europe. So we can actually see some investors that have started, for example, with ammonia as an end fuel, but now they're slowly going towards producing just hydrogen because, well, there's different reasons behind that. So I can see that there's a higher interest towards producing hydrogen as an end fuel rather than other fuels as ammonia or methanol, simply because it's a more complex process and involves a source of carbon, such as in the case of methanol, and it's often biogenic carbon, and that can produce some or can bring some barriers in the overall economy of these projects. And your first question, can you repeat it, please?
Yes. What is the anticipated impact of the P2X plan on energy markets and also the consumers?
Yeah. Well, I think on the markets, I suppose Power2X can really make a difference and develop its own energy market onto which we contribute. For the consumers, I would say that this all links to the climate agreements and the ambitions Denmark has in this transition towards a greener future. But it's also hard to comment much about this. We are also here in a governmental agency, and it's really hard to say much more about markets, since that's something that maybe some of the other presenters can maybe answer better to this question. So I would say I will limit myself to this, and hopefully it's enough.
Thank you, Dr. Andre, very much for your response. This certainly gave us more insights, and thank you once again for joining us. As you can see, there are still questions waiting in the Q&A box, but we don't have time to address them. I appreciate if you can stay longer.
Unfortunately, I cannot stay longer, but I left my email in the slides, and I'll be happy to answer any other questions if you can actually send those emails. So let's send those questions to my email. I would appreciate that.
We'll do that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. And now let's delve into our next speaker, Mr. Peter Osterkamp, Commercial Director, New Hydrogen Business of H2 Green Steel, to share the H2GS progresses.
Yes,
Mr.
hi,
Peter,
everyone.
the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. So just before I start, an eye on time. How much time? What should I aim for?
Yes, 15 minutes for presentation, and that would allow us more time for Q&A.
Perfect. Then I'll start a clock just so I keep track. And I'll share my screen, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, perfect. So pleasure to be with you. My name is Peter Osterkamp. I'm a commercial director in the growth team at H2 Green Steel. And I'm here to talk a little bit about our journey so far, about our project up in northern Sweden, where we're now in the process of building a green steel plant, and also about the other projects we're looking at. I'm part of the growth team at H2 Green Steel, which means I'm in the team that's looking at what we do beyond the project in northern Sweden. I'd say 95% of my colleagues are working on the Boden plant, because without that, there won't be any more projects. So that's very much the primary focus, but we are also exploring other opportunities. So I'll share my screen. So I guess that shows now.
Yes, it will.
Perfect. So starting off with who we are and why we exist, H2 Green Steel started very much as a result of the Paris Agreement, we could say, where all these countries committed to decarbonizing in line with what's needed to reach the 1.5-degree target. And one big challenge in that is these hard-to-abate industries, the industries that aren't easily electrified, where there's lots of different technologies being used, but hydrogen is quite central to most of them. So that's the purpose of H2 Green Steel. So we've put our mission as we decarbonize hard-to-abate industries, and we start with steel. Our first project is the steel plant in northern Sweden, but we don't see ourselves as a pure steel producer going forward, but that's where we start. And what we're doing for this first project is applying green hydrogen to transform the steel industry. So our plant will be up there in northern Sweden, that you can see on the map, in a town called Boden, very close to the Arctic Circle. And there we will produce steel with a 95% lower CO2 footprint than the traditional technology. We're aiming for 5 million tons per annum in a second phase, 2.5 million tons in the first phase. We're looking towards end of 2025 for start of production. And this is all powered by a giga scale electrolyzer that will be producing the green hydrogen we need. And the reason we are in northern Sweden is that you have extremely good conditions. You have hydropower, large amounts of hydropower. So you have this green base load, and it's very cheap as well, because right now that electricity is basically landlocked up in northern Sweden, and the production costs are very low, and the price is very low as well. So it's a very attractive, probably the most attractive location in the world for this kind of project. And it will be Europe's largest electrolyzer, about 740 megawatts. And we have the benefit of starting from a clean sheet approach. So we have quite a large team on the digital side that also are looking at how we can use digital technology to really optimize, and both when it comes to production optimization, when it comes to providing transparency, trying information to our customers, providing CO2 emissions per coil, that kind of thing. Many things we are doing in the digital space that are quite exciting as well. Right now, there's about 300 of us. We were founded about 4 years ago, so it's grown quite quickly. But the plant up in Boden alone will be about 1,500 employees when it's up and running. And just for context, this might be well known to many of you, but steel is one of the big emitters in the world. It's about 8% of global emissions, 5% in the EU. And for Sweden, which has quite a big steel industry comparatively, it's a large share. It's about 12% of our emissions. And just for context, our founders are the impact investment firm Vargas, who have, before us, they'd founded the company Polarium, which does batteries for mobile masts, and also Northvolt, the battery maker. And it was actually at Northvolt meeting of the board of directors where the genesis for H Green Steel came about, because one of the automotive board members of Northvolt was saying that it's all very good with batteries, but to create a green car or a green truck, you need green steel. And then our founders looked into what was the plan for green steel at this time. And basically the plans were very far into the future, 2040s even, and saying that it basically couldn't be done before that. But when they researched the technology, it seemed like the technology was basically already there. So here there was, so they identified these opportunities to start H Green Steel, and that's why we started. Since they've launched a company called Era that's working on heat pumps, which is another huge emitter in Europe. I mentioned this. The reason we're up in northern Sweden is it's 100% renewable base load, and it's also very low cost compared to the rest of Europe. So that's why it's for this kind of industry that requires a base load. The iron production can't ramp up and down as much. The hydrogen can, and the steel plant can ramp up and down, but since we're using this DRI technology, that needs to be at a very high utilization, both commercially but also technically. And that's why you need a stable power. This is some of the points about our plant up in Boden. The project as a whole is about 6.5 billion euros, 2.1 billion in equity and 4.2 in debt. We've also received a grant from the EU Innovation Fund for 250 million euros. One big part of how we've been able to do this, because we're a new company, we don't have a balance sheet, is we've drawn a lot of the learnings from how Northvolt were able to start and finance their plants. And one big part of that is signing these early take or pay agreements with customers for long periods of time, 5 to 7 years. And that can be used as collateral for the banks. And that helps the financing. So that was something new. That's not common in the steel industry to sign these long agreements, but we've been able to do that. We have a site, we have power, we have signed PPAs for a substantial part of the electricity we need. We have a full environmental permit granted. We have OEM contract signed for the steel plant. It's SMS Group. For the DRI tower, it's Midrex, and for the hydrogen plant, it's ThyssenKrupp Nucera. And we have most of the capex signed. The site is up and running. We have secured raw materials. Right now, we have contracts with Vale in Brazil and Rio Tinto in Canada, and we also have a agreement with a port. So that is, we have many of the things needed, but there's still, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think our equity raise was quite well noted in the press in the last year. It was one of the biggest projects during 2023. And here's some of our investors and customers. So you can see it's a mix on the equity investor side. It's both more traditional investment companies, many from Sweden, but we also have some of our suppliers like SMS Group and Kobelco, who own Midrex, who are investors in us, and also some of our customers like Mercedes, Scania, Kingspan, and so on. We also have some investors from abroad, for instance, Temasek from Singapore, HY24 from France, Just Climate from the US. So there's quite a broad group of equity investors. And if you look at our customer side, it's predominantly automotive, many are automotive, but we also have some steel resellers. We also have some in white goods, yellow goods as well. And I think what's common among our customers is that they need the green steel to realize their emission reduction targets. I mean, all of these companies, I think all of them, are signed up to science-based targets, so they need to reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030. And for these companies, that's not possible without green steel. So that's also why they're willing to pay a premium for the green steel. So we have approximately a 20 to 30% premium on top of the price of brown steel in these contracts already. And this is just to show a bit of the work that's been going on site. It's important to stress this is not a PowerPoint project anymore. It was for a couple of years, but now it's actually being built. This is from the groundworks and preparation of the land last autumn. There was a lot of piling needed. It's quite heavy machinery, all of this. This is from the winter when we started building vertically. Here you see in the top left, this is actually foundation for part of the steel plant. All this will actually be underground when it's ready. And the most recent photos I was able to get from our communications team are these. So you see, this is the site in May. It's 1 kilometer across and 2 kilometers long. And this is actually just the site for the iron and steel plant. The hydrogen plant is over here to the right. And we weren't able to find a site where we could fit everything. So that one's slightly separated, and the hydrogen is provided through a pipeline. And here you see a bit more detail. This is the foundation for the DRI tower. These are this is the early phases of the steel plant. So I think this is where the furnaces are. So that's now being built vertically. And just on the technology, I mentioned it a little bit. What we do instead of using coke and coal in the blast furnace and then a basic oxygen furnace is we use hydrogen that's produced from fossil-free electricity in a technology called direct reduction. So instead of using coal to bind the oxygen from the iron or the iron ore, the pellets in this case, we use hydrogen. So the result is vapor or steam, basically. And then the steel production process is completely electrified as well. And since we have this as an integrated process, we don't have any energy loss. We don't need to cool the material and reheat the material, which is also beneficial when it comes to energy use. And through this, we're able to produce a ton of steel by producing approximately 0.2 tons of CO2 compared to 2 tons in the regular process. And what we're doing now is basically using the blueprint we've created in Boden in northern Sweden and looking to recreate that in other parts of the world where you have similar conditions. So Canada is very similar to Sweden. There is a lot of hydropower, which is what we need. Brazil has both hydro and wind and sun, so it's a very interesting market. We're looking at the Iberian Peninsula as well, where we have a project there. There's hydro is not as much, but the sun and the wind is very good and quite complementary. So there we see we could make it work as well. And the US we're also looking at, but I think there it's a lot because of the IRA that we prioritized looking at US in this early stage. Otherwise, the US would probably not be one of the first markets we would look at. But with the support mechanism in the IRA, I think, like many companies, we're also exploring the US. And we're looking to then basically create the same platforms as in Boden, hydrogen making, iron making, and in some cases steel, in some cases we stop at the iron making step. So that's a bit different from geography to geography. And yeah, that's what I had to share with you today. So very happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Mr. Petter, for sharing with us the current stages of H2 Green Steel. And let's check out some questions for you. The first question, as you mentioned, that H2 Green Steel has made sustainable strides over your Boden site and also some future expansion plans. But can you explain a bit more about maybe the green steel potential in the UK and EU?
Well, I think what's tricky is, as I said, the iron making, because you need green baseload power that is cheap. And it's a bit different from, well, green, it needs to be fossil free. We have not said anything that it has to be renewable. We haven't said anything that we would say no to nuclear, but nuclear power is typically very expensive. So it needs to be a lot of power, and there needs to be a connection point to the grid where you can get a gigawatt, 1.5 gigawatt, and you need to have this baseload power. So that's the question when you look at, it's basically the electricity grid and the energy mix that makes it, that's important. So in Europe, I think for the full chain we're looking at, to us, it seems like the best places are northern Scandinavia. There might be potential, or we see potential in the Iberian Peninsula because you actually have wind and sun. And also possibly now it's quite complicated, but in Ukraine, that area could also be interesting. When it comes to Central Europe and the UK, we so far haven't focused on it. And I think it's mostly due to electricity prices and also what I said about being able to source this green baseload. And I think ArcelorMittal a couple of months ago also came out and said that maybe they won't be looking to import hydrogen, but rather import green iron, because that is extremely energy intensive, producing the green iron. So we think, and our strategy is to produce the green iron in sites in the world where the conditions are optimal for that. And then we can export the green iron as an input to steel industry in the EU, for instance. And there you'd obviously have to switch the technology to electric arc furnaces, but that you can do in more regions. That's possible in a lot more regions. Then we see it feasible producing green iron. So I think our view is that green steel, yes, but green iron is tricky in a lot of these countries.
And speaking of strategy, what challenges and opportunities do you foresee for H2 Green Steel as it aims to become a leader in sustainable steel?
I think our challenge is very much like many startups. I mean, there is so much potential. A lot of companies and countries and partners are interested in working with us on new projects, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we deliver the Boden project safely, on time, on quality. So we need to really make sure that and we're a new company and we're building the biggest industrial project in Sweden in history. So, I mean, that is challenging. We need to make sure that we are able to both execute on that and make sure that we don't miss out on opportunities around the world, because these sites, it's not only us looking at these different sites. I mean, it's obvious where it's most attractive and interesting to do green iron or green steel. So I think that's the challenge for us, to make sure that we have enough resources to be able to do both, and to do both well. I think that's the main challenge.
Certainly, Ms. Petter, we need to be aggressive, but also we need to be patient. And we really appreciate your informative answer, and thank you for joining us today. There are still two more questions in the Q&A box, and I hope you can stay longer to answer them.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we come to our next session. Welcome Mr. John Rixham, Head of Hydrogen Storage Development UK, Uniper Energy Storage. He will present hydrogen underground storage. And now the stage is now yours.
Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
Perfect. Okay, hello everyone. John Rixham, I'm the Head of Hydrogen Storage Development for Uniper Energy Storage, focused on our business in the UK. So I've worked in our energy storage business for the last 12 years. And in that time, I guess I've worked across different life stages of facilities, from construction through to midlife, in different commercial contexts, from boom to bust, and in various roles covering most functions of the business, from consenting through to managing operations. So I'm quite passionate about energy storage, and even more so about the role that it can play in enabling the energy transition. So yeah, I'm quite thankful for this opportunity to talk to you today about that passion. So Uniper Energy Storage sits within the wider Uniper Group, which is a multinational energy company, mainly focused in Europe. Uniper Energy Storage is one of the biggest players in natural gas storage in Europe. And the assets that we have, as well as, and most importantly, the people and the technical competencies that we have, put us in a good position to be at the forefront of this nascent hydrogen storage marketplace. We have facilities across Germany, Austria, and in the UK. We're the biggest provider of natural gas storage in Germany. And we have one facility in Holford, the facility that I'm sat at as I talk to you today, and the Holford facility in Cheshire. So I think it's widely accepted that for hydrogen to play a significant role in the energy transition, we need an answer to the management of disconnect in supply and demand. And we at Uniper believe that salt caverns are the premium option right now to solving that problem. However, there are a number of challenges that we, and by we I don't mean just Uniper, but the UK, the EU, have to overcome in order to make that outcome a reality, and to optimize the role that storage plays in the energy transition. So resources and supply chain is not a novel topic to storage, and I'm sure that all of you can talk an awful lot about how we kind of fix that particular challenge. So I'm not going to talk about that so much in this presentation. I'm going to talk more about the challenges that are novel to storage. So there are some technical challenges, there are some technical unknowns. There is a potential disconnect between what the market would drive us to build and what society needs from storage products. And we need to bridge the gap between the kind of the economics of building hydrogen storage and making it a reality. And more than likely, it requires intervention by governments to deliver that. So let's talk first of all about the technical challenges. Storage has a number of elements to the operational envelope that are novel and quite challenging. So we go to higher pressures, we change the pressure by a greater rate, we put moisture into the hydrogen, and we have a greater potential to contaminate the hydrogen. And because of that, there's quite a lot of uncertainty in how we design these storage facilities. Now, it's not a safety issue as such, because we just simply wouldn't build something that wasn't safe. It's more a cost challenge, because the more uncertainty, the greater the margin of error that you have to build into these facilities, and the more expensive they become. And if we let that over design go too far and that waste in investment go too far, then it ends up being a barrier to storage being viable. And at the very least, it ends up being a waste of resources. So we're not just starting out on this journey to understanding and mitigating those technical risks. We've been researching it for some time. So these studies that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, starting as early as 2016, and we've taken all of that research and used it as the basis for two industry-leading pilot studies, one in salt caverns and the other in porous rock formations. So the leading pilot study is at Krummhörn in northern Germany, and it's looking at storing green hydrogen in salt caverns up to a pressure of 245 bar. It's not cheap or simple to develop salt cavern storage facilities, so Uniper's committed 10 million, potentially more than that, with the German federal government in Lower Saxony contributing a further 2.375 million to the pilot study. The study's progressing well. We've done a hydrogen tightness test on the cemented casing, which I'm glad to say it passed. We've now completed solution mining the cavern, and we should have hydrogen first fill by the end of the year. In parallel to all of this subsurface work, we've been running a very detailed study on materials of construction and services in the storage application. We've actually been working with organizations like TUV to self-certify some of the materials of construction, and that in turn will be used to set standards for industry good practice in some of these extremes of application of pressures, of delta pressure, etc. And in so doing, we're actually assisting ourselves in the process of consenting these facilities and building up that picture of what industry good practice looks like, such that regulators have something to refer to when we're going through planning and consenting these high hazard facilities. So once we have the hydrogen in there, what's the next step? So that's where we really get into the detail of testing those materials of construction and the services, but also, and potentially even more importantly, understanding what happens to the hydrogen when it's in the caverns, what kind of quality of hydrogen we get when we withdraw it, how the thermodynamics of hydrogen and the impact on rock mechanics influences the commercial product that we can deliver. There's all sorts of really mature models available for natural gas, but all of that has to be revalidated for hydrogen. Our second pilot study looks at the injection of hydrogen into porous rock formations. So this is located at Bierwang, which is in southern Germany. It's fair to say that in terms of the science, it's at a lower stage of readiness than salt caverns. We're actually at the point of injecting hydrogen into the store and seeing how much of it we can get back out again. So far this year we've put 5% hydrogen injections into the store, and the initial results are good. Of the hydrogen that we injected, we got 90% of it back out of the store. But this is a really, really early stage, and we need to do an awful lot more work before we can prove that that porous rock formations like that which we have at Bierwang are a credible way of storing hydrogen. And even then, it's difficult to compare one porous rock formation to another, as we've already seen for the work that's gone into carbon capture underground storage. So the technical risks that's our kind of our wheelhouse. That's our area of expertise, and Uniper's in a really good position with the knowledge and skills that it has to do something about that, and therefore we're working quite hard towards closing out those uncertainties. It's the area that we're most in control of. And now I'm going to start talking about some of the areas where we're less in control. So to take a step back and look at the wider hydrogen value chain and how storage fits into that context. Storage can add value across the whole hydrogen value chain. In some cases, it's actually the seed that enables a load of the marketplace to develop. There's a bit of a problem there in terms of the economics, in that the good old chicken and egg question of the storage doesn't come after the demand. In a lot of cases, the storage is the seed that enables the demand. So if you look at all of those different use cases, each of them has a slightly different requirement in terms of the storage product. And what do I mean when I talk about product? So in broad terms, you could break down a hydrogen storage product into three categories. The capacity is the one that we talk about the most. So that's when the storage is absolutely full, what is the total capacity that can be stored? Yeah, but in some regards, it's not necessarily the most important storage product factor for some of these use cases. In many cases, it's the flexibility of the storage, by which I mean how much hydrogen you can move in and out of the facility, both instantaneously and over a period of time. So rates is the instantaneous point. So that's how much energy you can move per second, per day, per whatever unit of time you're most interested in. But cycles is potentially even more important. A cycle is taking a storage facility from empty to full and to empty again, and how many times you can do that over a set period of time without destroying the facility. And this is where the salt locks us in over time to some of those product capabilities. So some salt is really good at capacity, but not so good at flexibility. And the opposite is also true. Some salt is really flexible, but not as good as capacity, not as good at capacity. And the final category is agility. So some of those use cases require really fast startup times, and you just won't get that from some salt. Some of them require the storage facility to switch from an injection into the facility to a withdrawal really quickly. And together, capacity, flexibility, and agility is really important in terms of the decisions that we take now to deliver what's required at first in the nascent hydrogen storage marketplace, but to have the ability to scale and to develop over time as the market develops. So just to get into a little bit more detail and to illustrate the point that I'm making, these two graphs give you an illustrative example of two different hydrogen storage use cases. So use case one is green hydrogen being fed by offshore wind to an industrial off-taker with a flat use profile. Use case two is a more extreme use case of a green hydrogen product coming from offshore wind again, but supplying a large-scale hydrogen to power application. What you can see in the graph to the left is there's an awful lot of noise to this graph, as we would use the facility to manage within day imbalances in supply and demand. What that means is, whilst the capacity, the total capacity required by that off-taker is lower, they actually cycle maybe even 6 times the facility much more. So that's a much lower price facility to build and a much more cost-effective product to buy. Yes, so you're paying for less capacity, but you're cycling that pressure multiple times in the year. So that's a lower cost product. If we look at the graph on the right, what you're doing here is you're relatively slowly putting hydrogen into the store over the summer, so that in Q4 and Q1, you withdraw that hydrogen pretty quickly. So high flexibility and long duration withdrawals, but relatively low churns. There's much less noise on this graph here. So that means you need a much greater storage capacity. So almost 60% increase in capacity. So Uniper has to build a much bigger storage facility, and there's much less churns. So you're getting much less bang for your buck. Yeah. So in a purely market-driven world, you can clearly see that the use case on the left is much more attractive. And if we don't have the right incentives in the marketplace, then we potentially negate these more expensive and more complex use cases from occurring. And if what society needs, for example, is hydrogen to power to maintain security of supply in the power marketplace, well, then we need to do something about that disconnect. Which brings me on to talk about regulation and energy policy. So the key factors in making these quite expensive, quite complex, quite risky investments in hydrogen storage a reality are managing or mitigating cost risk, which is to say, price risk and volume risk. But even then, even if we can manage those two factors through government intervention, we still also need to do something more to incentivize those those use cases which society needs, but cost more, are more difficult to deliver, take longer to deliver. So we absolutely need to deliver value for money to the taxpayer if we're receiving subsidies to invest in these projects. But it isn't as simple to just think about what's the cheapest, what's the quickest to market. Sometimes we need to take some hard decisions to make sure that the most valuable facility is built. And in the early days of storage development, we need to find a happy medium, a kind of compromise that sits between all of those different factors. In the UK, we're in quite a good place in terms of the information that UK government has given us with regards to the hydrogen storage business model. We have more information on that model than anywhere else in Europe right now, which is great for me in an organisation where I compete for investment with all of the other markets that Uniper operates in. The proposed floor price model has clear potential to provide the certainty needed for investment. And they're talking about a 15-year contract, and they're talking specifically about mitigating both that volume and price risk. However, the devil is in the detail, and we continue to talk to the government in terms of the detailed design of that support mechanism, the timescales that we need to deliver these products by, how we speed up the process of planning and consenting such that it doesn't become a bottleneck to delivering a commercial operation, which is obviously something that Uniper isn't entirely in control of, even with its work to kind of develop an understanding of best practice on the technical side. Yeah, we need to work to make sure that the assessment of value for money includes how the products are optimized to deliver what society needs over time. And we need to integrate storage and transport infrastructure. That's something that I haven't talked about so much, but the transport infrastructure is integral to enabling storage to do what it needs to do. And vice versa, the storage is there to enable or to support the transport infrastructure. And that works on a local level, but it also works on a national level. The sooner we interconnect up the different areas of salt in the UK, the better we can make that overall product offering to the different off-takers in the value chain. So, in summary, there are some technology risks, and Uniper's working hard to do something about that. We have a strong belief that there is high demand for that storage product, but it is quite uncertain, and the market alone will fail to fill the gap between investment decisions and what's actually needed in the time that it's needed. And therefore, Uniper's working with stakeholders, both internally and externally, to build that stable support and policy and regulatory framework to develop hydrogen storage at the pace it's required. I am passionate about this subject, and that is the context that I approach all of these conversations, both internally and externally. You know, I left university as an environmental scientist, and I really wanted to work. I have no interest in building a white elephant. Uniper has this excellent opportunity to be part of this solution to one of the biggest challenges that face our society today, and I absolutely want us to be part of that. So that is everything that I wanted to talk about. Is there any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Rixham, for your very insightful and passionate speech, along with your vivid project illustration. Here we also got one question for you. It's a very important question. So if you have one silver bullet that could ramp up the whole hydrogen storage business, what would it be?
Okay, one silver bullet. So the most important thing that we have to overcome right now is to determine as a country what's needed, and then to have the faith to put in place the regulatory framework to provide the certainty that's needed to make that a reality, and to take those bold moves as soon as possible that enable us, without rushing, to make the best, least expensive but optimized storage products as soon as possible.
Definitely, you are correct that policy instruments are critical for private sector to act. And once again, I thank you for your great answers. It provides new perspectives and ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now let's welcome the following speaker, Dr. Dean Bielek, Chief Officer, External Affairs from CWP Global, where we can have a deeper understanding of hydrogen derivatives, clean ammonia. Dr. Dean, please start. Hi, Dr. Dean, can you hear us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
Apologies, I was just waiting for the mute to unblock. Really great to be able to join you, and Molly and colleagues, thanks a lot for making the necessary arrangements. I know you guys have got a number of exciting events coming up in the European space over the next few weeks, and so this is a great opportunity just to test some of the messaging and to get some feedback from others on where the areas of interest are, and indeed where there are opportunities for collaboration that can make things go faster. Molly, I think you were going to show the slides for me. Is that still the case?
Yes, please just pardon us for 5 seconds.
Great, thanks a lot. Well, what I might do is I might just get through some of the kind of early material, just so we don't waste any time. I'm going to run through some of the kind of background stuff fairly quickly, and just to give everyone an idea of what the CWP Global business is about. The business is about nearly almost 20 years old now. It started as a grid-connected wind business and became the biggest portfolio of grid-connected wind in Southeast Europe. Not long after that, a business unit was established in Australia. Oh, sorry, before I go to that, I should just say that the wind business in Europe is now run as a joint venture with the commodities trader Mercuria as a 50-50 joint venture. And if you could just go forward maybe a couple of slides. And the next one. Okay, so we're just looking here essentially at the 3 business units that are relevant in terms of the CWP global business overall. As I said to you, CWP Europe is now 50-50 JV with Mercuria. There's about 6 gigawatts under development across about 5 or 6 different countries, including a big project in Ukraine, which is obviously on pause. In Australia, we also developed the biggest wind power grid-connected portfolio of projects. That was sold, that business, after working through joint development with Partners Group, the Swiss private equity firm. That was sold to Andrew Forrest Private company, Squadron Energy, in late 2022 for 2.5 billion euros. And then I wanted to pivot, obviously, to the hydrogen business, which was launched in 2015 with our co-development with Intercontinental Energy of the Australian Renewable Energy Hub, which I'll come back to in a moment. I should note also that our hydrogen business portfolio has attracted investment from Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. That was confirmed mid last year. And we're now under that rubric developing 6 projects proactively across 3 continents. So that's Africa, Australia, and Latin America. But we are also pursuing a couple of early stage opportunities in the US, as was the case for H2 Green Steel. Obviously, the IRA and the production tax credits there is a critical piece of the puzzle. Next page, please. All right, I just wanted to put something up just to contextualize kind of why we're in this business and what the thinking was. Essentially, we've got an extraordinarily challenging task to ramp up what is essentially a new technological development, or at least putting together all the different parts of a green-based PTX project. But the task is enormous if we're going to get on the net zero scenario that the IEA has put forward in order to align with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And you can see that all of those curves looking at demand, supply, and required electrolyzer capacity, they're all essentially exponential curves. So really we need to get our skates on, and collaboration is going to be key. These projects are complicated. They require a lot of things to move in the right direction and at the right time. So we need to be cognizant of how challenging it is and work together to achieve it. Next page, please. All right, this is just to show what the current analysis is of how trade flows of green hydrogen are likely to emerge for the latter part of this decade and into the 2030s. This is something that Roland Berger did for us, looking at where things might get to by 2035. But as you can see, the really major exporters are basically Northwest Africa, Australia, Chile, and also some black, very dark areas there in the Middle East or Gulf region. All very important bases for producing green hydrogen because of the excellent renewables resources. But obviously there are other facets as well that make these places attractive for investment. Big, vast spaces out in the open, close to the coast, easy to get things on vessels, and trade routes that are proximate to key target markets, and the dominant markets are expected to be the EU, North Asia, and the US. So it's a bit of a complicated diagram, but it does give you a sense and I suppose an overview of where current project development is concentrated. Next one, please. All right, this is just a very general one. Let's skip this one. Let's just, hang on. Let's just very quickly, just a quick review of how we're approaching our desire to develop ultra scale, what we call kind of multi-gigawatt projects. Because the challenge is so great, because hydrogen has such a critical role to play in the decarbonisation of hard-to-abate sectors, the vision for the company in our hydrogen business is to pursue this with the idea of doing very big hubs that can pull together massive scale of production and deliver on the urgency and the scale that's required to meet our net zero objectives. So of course, in doing so, we look at the best resources in the world. We started probably 2 years before most other companies started thinking about this sphere of activity. So we've had a bit of a head start. As I said, gigawatt scale projects, we're not doing anything less at full scale than about 5 gigawatts. And for the bigger projects in the kind of 15, 20, or even 30 gigawatts, we obviously have to start with a smaller bite-sized chunk, looking at 3 to 5 gigawatts as an initial project phase to make it feasible for financing and to keep control of upfront costs, noting that these projects often require quite a big capex on infrastructure. And so we need I suppose, not to go too small, such that the infrastructure spend is spread too thinly across a commercial endeavour. The other aspect that's key to our business is we are very open, almost agnostic, as to which offtake vector we prefer in each given location. The location obviously determines to some extent what is workable, but it's not clear yet from a kind of market perspective which of the different potential offtake vectors from green hydrogen is likely to dominate, become price competitive at an earlier stage. And so we are planning and working on development of our projects with what we call offtake optionality in mind. So the ability to pivot over the next 18 months to 2 years to ensure that we develop projects with the right offtake mix before we go into feed and detailed engineering. And that's a really critical task for us over the next couple of years. Next one, please. All right, this is just to kind of highlight that we're very, very focused on the need to ensure that all the different pieces of technology work in an optimized way together to produce the best results. We have a very large and focused technology team, which is looking at how we'll supply and construct our projects and how to optimize their interrelationship with one another. And very key to this is we've developed our own digital twin, which in a visual way looks at how the different pieces of technology will work together and how we should drive the power gen into the system to ensure optimal production and most efficient production to achieve lower costs before we feed into electrolysis. Next one, please. All right, this is just a kind of top level view of where we are focused at the moment. You can see that USA, as I said before, has just come on over the last couple of years, but we're close to landing something, particularly in Texas. We're also looking elsewhere. By far the most progressed projects is the AREH project, which is Northwest Australia to the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And the second one is Mauritania, Northwest Africa, just south of Morocco. Can we just flick through and get to those projects? And I'll just highlight a couple of aspects there, which will lead more so into the offtake vectors and then some of the particular questions that you would have need to address. All right, here's just an overview, and you can see very clearly the massive scale that we're attempting to achieve with some of our projects. But obviously, the critical aspect, particularly in the 2020s, is to have a bite-sized chunk of each of these projects to make them financeable. We're looking to get to FID on most of these in around the 28, 29 timeframe, but there's a couple that are going to be earlier than that. They're the ones I'll focus on over the next couple of slides, please. Next one. And again. All right, this is the first project. We started this in 2015. It's moved along now very quickly over the last 18 months, with BP having taken a controlling share of the project. They are now the operator of the project, and we're very focused now on preparing to go into feed on the first phase of the project. That first phase is going to be the delivery of 1 to 2 gigawatts of zero emissions power for local industry in what's called the Pilbara region of Northwest Australia, which is one of the biggest iron ore basins in the world. So the first task will be to electrify the activities of the miners in that region, and then move to other uses as we scale up the power production over time. So the second is going to be to move just from transmitting electrons from the project site down to, if we just move to the next one, it's really useful just to show where everything's located. So you can see the development envelope with the red outline there. Then there's a link 1 shown in a dotted red line going from the development envelope down to the Port Hedland port. Port Hedland is one of the top 2 iron ore export terminals in the world. And the whole region, the Pilbara region, represents the highest emitting region and the highest potential decarbonisation opportunity in Australia by a factor of 50%. The region consumes 3 billion litres of diesel a year, mostly for transport and haul trucks for the mining activities. And so if we're able to electrify and to use hydrogen to decarbonise, that represents an enormous decarbonisation opportunity. And all of the miners, there's 4 main miners, there's BHP, Rio Tinto, Fortescue, and Gina Ridehart's company. All of them have a very big emissions footprint because of these activities. And as part of Australia's meeting of its Paris Agreement targets, these companies are now going to have to pay if they don't reduce their emissions. And they've all got targets for 2030, so they want electrons, green electrons, quickly. As you can see in the 5th point there, we're looking to get to FID 2026-27 on the first phase, so the 1 to 2 gigawatts of electrons. And then as we get into kind of 28, looking to bring on stream a first electrolyser at the Port Hedland industrial site. We're in talks with POSCO about whether they will offtake hydrogen for their DRI plant, and similarly with Fortescue also wanting to do DRI. Really exciting opportunity. All right, next one, please. So we have used the template of the development of the AREH project as an exemplar for how we've developed this project in the northwest corner of Mauritania. Again, a very vast coastal desert site with access to the water, huge and kind of world-class resources. So we have now done 24 months of resource measurement across that 8,500 square kilometres of land, and we're picking up some of the absolute best wind resources in the world, averaging about 10.5 to 11 metres per second, supplemented by outstanding solar. So we're going to be able to run our electrolyzers in Mauritania at much higher than 70% capacity. Our technology team says this is as close to baseload as you can get with renewables pretty much anywhere in the world. We've been developing this project now for 4 years. The ultimate vision is to get to 30 gigawatts, but that will take 10, 15, if not 20 years to build. So we are focused at the moment on planning for a 3 to 5 gigawatt first phase, not dissimilar to the AREH concept. And we hope that that will be able to reach FID in the next kind of 2 to 3 years, and then hopefully be able to start producing green hydrogen just at the start of the next decade. There's an enormous market for the product here, and the very important thing to remember, as is the case with AREH, is that in the north of Mauritania, so to the northeast of the northeast corner of this site, is another very high-grade iron ore basin, co-located with some of the best resources in the world, renewables resources. And so again, it holds up its hand as a superior opportunity to do direct reduced iron for export to Europe. Next one, please. There's just a few data points here on the green iron opportunity. Currently, the government, SNIM, which is the national mining company, produces 13 million tonnes a year, but they have an ambition to double or treble that production over the next 10 to 15 years. If that happens, it makes Mauritania potentially one of the biggest green iron hubs in the world if we get all of our ducks in a row, and if everyone collaborates in an expedited fashion and shares a vision to achieve this outcome. What is interesting is that the EU, in particular at the highest political levels, had Ursula von der Leyen go down to Mauritania in February, and she said very clearly, we see Mauritania as a partner to start bringing green iron into Europe. That is a significant pivot from what has been the approach over recent years to heavily subsidise European steelmakers to build their own DRI plants, and not necessarily hydrogen-based DRI plants, in order to maintain steel making in Europe, or I should say the direct reduction process in Europe, and to reduce carbon footprint. But if you look over time, and there are some analyses which will come out soon about this, there is a 10 to 15% saving if you do the direct production at the energy source where it's cheapest, and if it's co-located with the iron basin. And that is exactly the scenario in Mauritania. So we're very, very excited about this prospect. You can see the project site there, the different nodes or collections of solar panels around electrolyzers, and obviously the wind turbines are dotted right across that site. And as you can see there, the shaded region in the west, that's where we envisage starting our process with a 3 to 5 gigawatt first stage. Huge capacity potential. We're hoping to have a 3.5 million tonne per annum green DRI plant in place before the end of the decade. All right. Molly, how long have I got still?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. Well, do you want to move to the questions? Because largely the following slides, if you skip past our project in Djibouti and then the last couple, they are intended, skip past that one, they are intended to address really the issues around offtake that you sent through. I'll just quickly pick up here. We see two very important and prevailing opportunities for offtake from our ultra large scale green hydrogen projects. One is green ammonia for shipping, and that will apply, for example, both to the opportunity in Australia, where there's a huge number of vessels taking iron ore and other minerals from Northwest Australia to Asia. And then Mauritania, where will be a huge opportunity also with the iron ore that we expect to be loaded onto ships and the massive mining expansion that will come. And we see the big drivers here as the various regulatory pushes that are encouraging the transition to green fuels in the maritime world. Obviously, what's happening in the EU with FuelEU Maritime, the IMO strategy, which has the potential to drive this at the global level, and also some leading shippers in the EU who are demonstrating through their ordering of vessels their desire by 2030 to start to switch over to at least dual fuel use, but eventually to 100% green ammonia, if that's the market that consolidates. Again, also the technology readiness, and we're seeing various shipbuilders starting to produce ammonia capable vessels. And I should say also that we have a strategic partner, oil and gas major in our project in Mauritania, and they are quite bullish about the potential that by the kind of 2032, 2033 timeframe, we might actually be seeing transport of liquid hydrogen despite the challenges posed by the physical properties. All right, next one quickly. You can see also the massive kind of scale up in that third box on the right. Something on pricing. I just wanted to posit here where grey ammonia is at the moment, where blue ammonia appears to be, but also to use this Platts data, which shows how volatile the pricing is at the moment, even as blue just gets going as a market. And so with that in mind, it's very difficult to start to price out into the distance what it's going to look like. I've just listed here what we see as the key drivers of price going into the future. There's a hell of a lot of uncertainties there. A lot of it relates to who's going to pay for infrastructure. So for example, in Europe, who's going to pay for ammonia crackers if that becomes a key import to support the emergence of the hydrogen industry. And the other big one is the cost of capital, a kind of a delta of 0.5, 1 or 2% on interest rates applicable to a project can completely overturn the financial credibility of a project. And it's really important. I think the other thing we're seeing there is that the cost of capital can be affected, and the willingness of the private sector banking community to get involved really depends on off-takers getting involved in the project, even at the equity investment level. And I think that was the key to unlocking the Neom Air Products deal. All right, very quickly, just on DRI, the next one. All right, again, the green iron for green steel opportunity. We see Europe as being the major early uptaker of green iron. We've already seen, for example, through what H2 Green Steel is doing, a willingness on the part of off-takers, for example, in the automobile industry, to pay a green premium, given that those companies and their customers have net zero orientation, and also obviously supported by policy triggers, including the removal of free allowances under the EU ETS for steelmakers, and the future application of CBAMs at the border to more carbon intensive product. Again, the end use demand is coming, car companies, construction companies, etc., and that we expect just to increase as the impact of the removal of free allowances kicks into gear. And the other thing is, at the moment, really DRI, hydrogen base is the key technological approach that we see prevailing at the moment. We've got a very strong collaboration with Midrex and Primetals on this. I think that's the technology that H2 Green Steel is using at Bowden. But just in the middle square and the square on the right, you can see also, again, a massive scale-up opportunity and one that we're keen to meet. So I hope that addresses some of the questions. No need to come back to them. But if there's any kind of specific aspects on the pricing, happy to try and go into that, albeit without having a very deep level of expertise in that area. I leave that to our commercial team.
Thank you, Dr. Bielik. Thank you for your amazing speaking and showcasing CWP's progresses. I believe you have drained all my questions, but I do have one to wrap up the session. So I think it would be a $1 billion one. So as a developer, from a developer's perspective, how can we increase the number of FIDs for green ammonia projects and in a rapid pace?
All right, well, look, I mean, that's a kind of really complicated questions, because there are so many different aspects of putting together a large-scale green hydrogen or PTX hub. Really, the thing that I feel will unlock FIDs on some of these larger scale projects is, one, a kind of a group of off-takers that are willing to make a leap of faith to some extent. We don't expect them to make stupid decisions, but everyone's having to take risks here. And so that needs to come not only on the project developer side, but also on the off-taker side as well. And often that will be driven by corporate targets and strategies. So for example, in the Pilbara, the decarbonisation targets of the miners is driving them towards us saying we need green power now. And that's having a really good impact. Similarly, clarity on policy and its stability into the future is really important. So, for example, the IRA and not having conclusion on final guidance from US Treasury on how the 45V production tax credit is going to be applied. That has, even in our direct experience, hampered final investment decisions from potential project partners. And then the third aspect is there are various analyses showing that if we're going to scale up at the pace we need, about half of that scale up is going to need to come from emerging markets and developing countries. And so there's a real need for the multilateral development banks and development financial institutions, bilateral ones, to step in with creative green bonds or other financial instruments that help to reduce risk. That's a critical piece of the puzzle as well.
I appreciate your brilliant reply, Dr. Bielik. It offers fresh insight and viewpoints for our audience. Thank you. And then we have our next speaker ready, Mr. Marco Raffinetti, CEO of Hyphen Hydrogen Energy. Please join me to welcome Ms. Marco to bring us some perspective of Hyphen in African markets. Marco, now I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. If you can allow me to share my screen.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak to colleagues today. given that we're running a little bit late, and the previous speakers who focus a lot on market, I won't touch on that unless there's specific questions. I'll focus on what the key drivers are of what we believe makes green hydrogen projects bankable and viable. So my name is Marco Raffanetti. I'm the CEO of a company called Hyphen, which is a joint venture specifically established in order to develop a green hydrogen project in Namibia. We're somewhat different to some of the other countries around the world or projects around the world. And Namibia tendered out its land to the private sector to develop large-scale green hydrogen projects. And Namibia is one of the few countries in the world where you have large tracts of state-owned land that is high-quality co-located solar and wind that is owned by government, and where you don't have, that isn't currently occupied by other activities. So what that does is that presents Namibia with an opportunity to plan at scale. And ultimately, if you listen to some of the previous speakers, we need a large amount of these projects. Each project on its own is very, very large, but we ultimately need hundreds and thousands of these projects. And therefore, it's the pathway to scale that is really required, and we think is a key driver. So just very roughly, Namibia is one of the 35th largest country in the world, the second least populated in terms of population, 3 million odd people. And by and large, those people are located in cities and on farms to the north. So the area where we're located, for example, it's the first hydrogen valley being developed by the country. It's 20,000 square kilometers. There's not one person who lives in that project area. The project that we're developing is roughly 7 gigawatts of co-located solar and wind to produce around 350,000 tons of hydrogen a year, converted to ammonia for export, and is around 2 million tons of ammonia developed in 2 equal phases of 1 million tons each. Given that Namibia is still a developing country, it's one of the most unequal from a Gini coefficient perspective. Namibia is really looking to use green energy and the green energy transition to retransform its economy, effectively jumping over the normal traditional way of developing economies, where economies become heavily industrialized through the emission of carbon. They're looking to go straight to an industrialized economy that uses green energy. And green hydrogen has been identified by the government as one of those key vectors. Another unique feature of our project is that government is a co-shareholder in the project and shares risk alongside of developers. That's very, very important, because ultimately having alignment between a government and the private sector is very important in a market that is still mature and developing. In terms of what drives cost of production, everybody starts with wind and solar, and it is very important. You need to have both wind and solar, and those need to be negatively correlated. So you want the sun in the day, the wind at night, to feed a steady stream of supply into your factory that is where you run your electrolyzers. Very, very important that you get that right, because that ultimately drives your load factors. This is the starting point for any project. You need to select a country with high quality renewable resources. And as the previous speaker from CWP mentioned, there's a number of countries geographically, Australia, Southern Africa, parts of South America, and the Middle East that are very well suited to this. But as you can see, what's very important, if you look at the bottom right-hand box, that is the combined capacity factor at an electrolyzer based on the co-located wind and solar on an average annual basis, taking the single best resource in each country. You can see that the cost curve is flat, or is relatively flat. So South Africa at the bottom end of this particular analysis, and at the top end, you have Egypt. There isn't a differential of 2 or 3 times. It's 10s to 20% differential. That means that the renewable resource, although important, particularly when you compare it to something like Europe, where the renewable resource is much, much lower than this, what is driving the cost of green hydrogen production is less the quality of sun and wind, which you have to have, is the buildability of the project. So you can have a very good resource, but if you cannot get it onto a ship, or you cannot build on the piece of land, or the cost of constructing on that land is very, very expensive, you don't have existing port infrastructure that you can leverage, it becomes very, very hard to make these projects work. because ultimately it's a large amount of capital that you need to scale up. So you cannot solve for natural conditions that are not suitable. So, for example, if you are an export-focused project, you're located in a very sparsely populated part of a country, and you have very, very difficult geotechnical conditions or local conditions to load a vessel. You have to build out expensive port infrastructure. That becomes very difficult for the first projects to get built. So you really want to have low-cost first projects from a buildability perspective. But the most important thing, or virtually the most important thing for us, is the cost of capital. I think the previous speaker mentioned the sensitivity of project economics to the cost of capital. You can solve a lot in engineering. What you cannot solve for is a high country risk, because a high country risk will immediately impose a higher cost of capital that you simply cannot overcome through optimization, because the deployment of money always wants a risk premium, and that risk premium is something that changes over a long period of time, not a short period of time, as countries develop. So you have to earn trust from a risk perspective, and that means you have to start out with a low country risk. And that was one of the primary drivers, if not the primary driver, of why we focused as a consortium on Namibia, was driven by country risk, because Namibia is the second best governed country on the African continent, has a very, very low risk profile, and they do the basics incredibly well when it comes to legislation, the rule of law, freedom of the press, all the things that are very, very important to policymakers and to customers. Because ultimately, we're talking about rebuilding an energy world, an energy dependency, and we think geopolitical factors are going to play an oversized role in where these investments are placed, because it is a large amount of money, and there needs to be confidence that countries are going to be long-term stable partners. So unlike oil and gas deposits or certain metals and minerals that are located only in specific countries around the world, every country technically has the ability to make green hydrogen, because everybody has sun, wind, and solar at some level. It's a question of scale and the risk profile associated with those countries. In terms of from a technical development perspective, we've been working on the project for close on 3 years now. We've done an enormous amount of work, from measurements of the various renewable resources, and a lot of people focus on what's on the screen today, which is all the technical aspects for the development of the project. Now, those are important. You can't build out any project without making sure that your wind measurement campaign has been done, your solar resource has been done, you have a port that you've designed, infrastructures can be established at competitive cost. But this is only part of the story. A very big part of the story is the bankability of the country and the legal agreements and frameworks that you have in place. So because our project was tendered by the government as part of a tender process to allocate the land out for the rights to develop the first project, we have the rights to build out the full vertically integrated value chain. So from a project finance perspective, if there are any bankers in the audience, this is critically important, because project finance hates project on project risk, absolutely hates it. It prices project on project risk at a very high level. So that means if you have a port or a water desalination facility that needs to be developed by a third party, and that's a relatively small percentage of overall capital expenditure, that becomes a very big drag on your project from a risk perspective. So our holistic approach to the project was to design not only from an engineering perspective, but from a financing perspective and from a legal perspective. When it comes to bankability of countries, it's critically important that you have the support of government, and government will sign up to certain obligations to get lenders comfortable in order to deploy billions of dollars of funding. That means having provisions such as being subject to international arbitration, having the right taxation and foreign exchange legislation available in country in order to enable the execution of these projects. These are considerations that we often see developers and project investors overlooking the importance of the ecosystem that is required outside of engineering to enable projects. So for example, if you are developing your project in a developing country, you simply are not going to be in a position to localize the foreign exchange risk. That needs to be established in a way that you are not localizing foreign exchange risk. If you cannot get a country to agree to do it in that way, it makes the bankability of your project incredibly difficult. In terms of geographic supply, there are really three key markets that cannot achieve net zero on their own, that are geographically well suited to be supplied from the Southern African region. And those are Northwestern Europe in the main, is the main industrialized part of the European economy, Japan and Korea. And for various reasons, they simply are unable to achieve net zero with their current levels of industry, with own production of hydrogen-based low carbon hydrogen. It's simply impossible with the available resources and land. That means they face a tough choice. They either deindustrialize and move some of their production into, or production or capacities into other countries, or they simply deindustrialize in total and change their business models. We don't think they're going to move away from deindustrialization. There's certain things that countries are very proud about and are part of their heritage. So we will see, we believe that you'll continue to see, for example, in the automotive industry in Germany remaining a big producer of vehicles. That's not something that we see German producers deindustrializing that and allocating that out into other countries. And really, so what becomes important if you're a foreign country and you need to encourage the importation of hydrogen into your economies. You know the first projects are going to be expensive, the same way that renewables were expensive 20 years ago and went through an enormous cost reduction. Hydrogen is the same, but the scale that you start is very different. So where in wind and solar projects you could start with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of projects, in green hydrogen, if you're export focused, you need to start at the billion scale. Billions of dollars. That makes it very different. So you're making very, very big bets up front, as opposed to a large number of small bets. This is obviously very, very critical from a importer geography perspective, because ultimately having one project or two projects or three projects of relatively small scale established in a country does not help you achieve your decarbonization goals. Our project at excess of $10 billion US only achieves the decarbonization of one large steel plant. We need thousands of these projects to achieve net zero. So we're 350,000 tons. Various forecasts for green hydrogen by 2050 is something that very low forecasts are 300 million tons, high forecasts are 600 million tons. Whatever that number ultimately ends up being, it's a hell of a lot of projects that need to be developed, and it's very, very difficult to do so. So therefore, those countries and those regions that have an ability to show a pathway to scale, we think are going to be very important, because ultimately there is a return to those imported geographies through getting a subsidization through subsequent projects on the high cost of initial projects. So what we focused with the government of Namibia has been, how do we help the government develop the first project to be an enabler of subsequent projects, to de-risk subsequent projects, with cost of capital being such a key driver of the cost of production, in order to enable scalability, to make the country more attractive to foreign countries from an import perspective. So we have worked with the government on this, on what we call a common use infrastructure approach for the first valley, where effectively the first project will come in, build out the port infrastructure, gas pipelines, road infrastructure, water desalination and transmission lines, in order to enable other projects to connect. So when the next project comes along, the project risk associated with execution is vastly reduced compared to the first project. This then also allows you to plan at scale. So this first hydrogen valley that Namibia has earmarked for development, on a very conservative basis, being very respectful of the natural environment from an environmental sensitivity perspective, has a capacity of around 3 million tons of hydrogen, but that's equivalent to around 18 million tons of ammonia. And we have designed a full system to be able to accommodate that full volume being produced and exported and managed through the region for export. A subsequent plan that we are working with the governments of Namibia and South Africa and technology providers is ultimately to see how can this hydrogen valley link into South Africa, which is a top 15 global carbon emitter in the world, in order to assist South Africa achieve its decarbonization goals, as well as provide clean energy into the region. These projects have a lot of co-benefits because you have a large amount of curtailed energy. Even when you optimize your design, you have the ability to provide some of that energy. Our waste product is We have some free energy that can be made available to help improve energy security in the region and increase access to energy. So ultimately, this is what Namibia is planning, is effectively to develop 3 hydrogen valleys, of which we are in the first, which has the best resource, because you've got to be the lowest cost right up front, but ultimately develop 3 hydrogen valleys in the country, all on state-owned land, all land being unoccupied, in a consistent and structured manner as a long-term trade partner. Now, even if Namibia achieves that and achieves the 15 million tons of hydrogen that it's looking at developing at the low case, that is still a very, very small amount of global supply, even if you look at some of the more pessimistic forecasts for global hydrogen demand around 300 million tons by the turn of by 2050. Molly, let me stop there. I've gone through that quite quickly in the interest of time, and hopefully that wasn't too fast. Happy to take questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Raffinetti, for delivering such an inspiring address. Our audience would like to ask some questions. And the first one to you is, of course, the cost. How competitive do you see Africa hydrogen producers' landed cost of hydrogen in demand market, in key demand markets mentioned in Northwest Europe, in Japan, and also in Korea? This question is raised by Mizuho Bank.
Thanks for the question. So I think going back to my presentation, you start with the resource, and everybody is equal in terms of having to buy wind turbines, solar panels, electrolyzers. So the capital cost of developing a project is dependent upon the quality of your resource. But there isn't a large differential between country A, B, C, D in Africa based on the quality of their resource. Some are better than others, but it's not the determining factor. It really is the cost of capital. So high-risk geographies that do not have the right policies, government support, where governments will not enter into direct agreements with lenders, where you have project-on-project risk, that is ultimately what drives competitiveness, as opposed to looking at projects on an individual basis and trying to compare them. That's why we focus very much on project financing fundamentals, because that's what lenders understand. That's how lenders manage risk. And if you do not manage lenders' risks, you cannot drive down the cost. You need to do that at a fundamental level. I think another advantage that developing countries have, which most of Africa falls into that category, is the ability to leverage additional forms of financing not commonly available to other players. So, for example, the development financial institutions, the multilaterals, have a very strong strategic interest in seeing Africa's development and are likely to enable policies and funding in order to enable countries to achieve their objectives. That will help to drive down the funding cost of projects and make projects more competitive. So it's somewhat of an iterative process to do that. Also, strategic arrangements with foreign countries are very important. So, for example, we have applied for and are on the final list to be approved as a foreign project of strategic national interest to Germany. This would provide additional policy or financial support or mechanisms to the project that are non-standard. So effectively opening up a potential series of bespoke solutions for a project in order to bring down financing. So we have this challenge where these projects are expensive by any measure. Even when you optimize them, they're going to be expensive. So how do you bridge that gap through financial engineering? The financial engineering is incredibly important in order to lower your cost of production, to make it more attractive and lower the differential between green and gray products. Long answer to a short question, but it is a very complicated space.
Yes. And the second question is, what is the project timeline post 2024? As we have seen from your presentation, the hydrogen project has been at a very advanced stage. But what about the development post 2024?
Yeah, so effectively, we're looking at around a 2.5 year to a final investment decision, and then it's around a 2-year build for the first phase of the project. And then we would like to roll directly onto the second phase. So effectively, we're designing the project. We're doing feed on phase 1 and 2, but we'll implement phase 1 as the first step. I think the big timing differential in that is there's two factors that we don't control. One is the stage of the market. the market needs to develop the relevant policies in order to stimulate demand. And I think the previous speakers touched on that quite eloquently. I think the second is, from a government perspective, establishing a new industry is hard. This is very hard. So government needs to be very deliberate about the tax policies, the foreign exchange structures that will establish the regulation of industry. And so that means that new legislation needs to be developed in country to enable that. And the government is very well advanced in starting to map all that out, but that legislation still does need to be passed. Those are the things that we think will enable projects. And I think, and if you are in a developing economy, we think even if you developed economy, even in Australia, incentivized production taking place in Australia, because what you can't have is a high tax burden in an industry that is currently being subsidized, because then you have effectively tax dollars flowing from the receiving country to the producing country. That's not the intention. I think taxes need to be fair and equitable. And we don't see project developers talking about these fundamentals of banking projects. We see everybody talking about engineering. Engineering is important, but you've got to get the tax legal systems right, the concession agreements right. The comfort for lenders needs to be very, very high to drive down the cost of financing.
Thank you, Mr. Raffiati. Your response is greatly appreciated, and I can see still there are some questions regarding the demand market and regulations. I would appreciate if you can answer that in the Q&A box. But now I have to put a stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, and now it's time to get into our final topic for today's session. It's Mr. Nick Boriso, Vice President of Business Development from 8 Rivers. 8 Rivers is one of the leading energy transition players in the US market, and Mr. Boriso is going to share how they accelerate decarbonizations. Mr. Boriso, the stage is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you, delegates. Thank you for all of the attendees that have hung in there for this marathon of a webinar. And certainly, I will be building off of some of the comments that were made in previous presentations, but from the perspective of our company's journey, and as well as the US-based policies and lessons learned, frankly, since we are currently in the middle of those policies being now revised and reformulated to align with the feedback that they've gotten from the market. So I will start off with just a quick disclaimer that obviously the statements that I make are my opinions, as well as some of the information that's provided is confidential to 8 Rivers. So appreciate your being able to maintain that. But as a starting point, I wanted to highlight our sponsor for this segment, which is 8 Rivers. We are a pure play clean tech company. We've been in development now for over 16 years, and one of the largest patent holders in the clean tech space at the moment. We've also been very successful in raising capital and grant funding internally. And primarily, we are a technology developer. And more recently, we've built up our project development arm to bolster the commercialization of those technologies. So I will be throughout this presentation using this as the backboard for my discussion, but also I think hopefully giving a little bit more of a pragmatic information about some of the policy impact, both positive and negative, to development of projects in the United States. So just from a high level perspective, I'll talk through our brand through partnerships and innovation. We'll talk about some of the market-based factors, as well as some of the considerations that project developers, investors into projects within the U.S. should take into consideration in developing their own projects. And I will call all projects low carbon. I know that generally we try to stay in lanes of green and blue, but one of the aspects of the U.S. policy is since they are moving more towards a framework that is based on carbon intensity, we start to get away from the use of particular colors and talk more about carbon intensity of projects. So I wanted to just quickly share this history of our company. Starting in 2008, we developed a technology called the alum-FETVET cycle, which was the means of inherently capturing CO2 that was produced from conventional fuels and using it to produce power using a specific turbine that was designed to handle supercritical CO2 and loop that back to the oxy-combustion process at the front end of the AFC process. And from that perspective and from that starting point, went on to build a portfolio of technologies that use that fundamental core technology at its heart. So we now have a portfolio of technologies that we are deploying and developing to the market. But I think more importantly from this slide is two pieces. Is number one, we spun off a company called Net Power, which went public in 2023 with the help of Oxy and EQT, and is now listed as a public company on the New York Stock Exchange, as well as built partnerships throughout that period that were core to our technology development and project development pathway. And I believe Dr. Dean highlighted some of those aspects of the importance of building those partnerships as part of the overall framework of your own company's journey. So now we stand on a number of platforms that all of these product lines are now in development. I will be focusing primarily on our 8RH2 technology, which is utilizing the AFC core components to derive hydrogen and ultimately hydrogen derivative final fuels for the purpose of sending to the market. And I'll use our project that we're currently in development called Cormorant, which I will talk specifically later on in this presentation to highlight some of the trials and tribulations of that project development. I think one thing that I think is an underlying current behind all of the presentations that were delivered earlier is for companies to, as you're going through your technology development, to not only think about as was mentioned earlier, the engineering aspects of the project, the financial aspects of the project and technology, but also to understand the market that you're developing the technology into. And our premise, especially if you think about a company that was founded over 15 years ago, is there was no tax incentive program at the time, no real carbon tax or framework for CO2 removal or reduction. So our premise was to look at ways that we could scale up technology to the energy demands of a growing population and an increasing prosperity. So although we are utilizing conventional fuels in most cases, and we have recently, in the term of pivoting, are also utilizing traditional green fuels such as biomass and municipal solid waste as a feedstock for our technologies. This became the core tenet of our project and technology development going forward. So I wanted to get into some of the market discussion, because I think this is ultra relevant to any project that really is being developed, and understanding which part of the market you're selling to, even in the USA IRA framework, is very important, because we can devise the best technology scheme, go through all the wonderful engineering that's required, and ultimately come up with a better mousetrap that that the industry has not used yet. But ultimately, we still need a demand for the product. We ultimately need to understand how those markets move. And if you haven't spent a lot of time in this space, I encourage you all to further understand this part of your project development, because ultimately understanding where the use cases of your finished product will end up will fundamentally affect how you handle the financing part of it. As was mentioned earlier, because we have a relatively uncertain market and use customer at the moment, other than some of the conventional utilization pathways, such as ammonia fertilizer, metals production, and CPI, we are now faced with a new segment of the market that's now emerging, increases uncertainty, and the expectation in a lot of cases, especially to get your project to FID, is that the offtake component needs to be a much longer period of time. So understanding that aspect of where your product will end up in the market is vitally important. And what I've done is just put together some of the road mapping that we look at as far as not only where projects are developing, but also the use cases for those potential shipping channels in the future, because that helps us to align ultimately where we land in terms of siting a project. Further to my earlier point about the demand and sort of why the United States, why North America, and probably the most obvious piece is that the low cost of fuels, low cost of energy helps support the development of projects, not only from the perspective of purely green technology, but also from all of the colors of the spectrum. So the U.S. IRA program has really catapulted a lot of the development around all phases of projects and all types of hydrogen and hydrogen derivative products. And this graph, I think, obviously shows that what it's given us in North America, particularly in the U.S., is a critical head start on the rest of the markets. I know some of the project development timelines that were discussed were 2030 and beyond, but really the narrative in the United States is that we need to start working on decarbonization now and use the tools that we have as a bridge as those other technologies are really starting to ramp up. So I wanted to shift a little bit of the conversation away from some of the ambitious aspects of it, but also talk about some of the pragmatic and realistic aspects of having the policy in place and what that ultimately turns up in finding other hurdles that are created as once there's a policy in place, and you sort of remove the excuse that the legislation is not there to support clean energy development. And there's a number of reasons for projects to be put on hold or delayed or canceled, but ultimately a lot of them pertain to the particular details at local, state, and federal levels, including such things as being able to identify once Class 6 wells were identified as a potential pathway for hydrogen hubs and decarbonization hubs to support both green and blue technologies. There was the fundamental issue that the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, became overwhelmed with applications from individual companies and landowners that wanted to establish the wells on their property. And as a result, we had a flurry of states that went after legislation to identify their own primacy to be able to permit Class 6 wells and make it easier for that process, easier for companies to develop their projects. Also core to some of the challenges, and this is an example of probably many of you seen the classic duck curve of power generation and renewable availability in the state of California. And as we are thinking about project development, obviously this is in the back of everyone's mind, even for our own projects where we can source grid power. There's a concern around the 100% availability of renewables and what that does to affect the overall carbon intensity of our projects, as well as the financing piece. So this is sort of a tale of a couple maps just to highlight as you're thinking about where to locate a project, or where would be the best place to consider a site for your own project is number one, to think about which states are more favorable to decarbonizing power, and that's this graphic in the top left. And it's not to say that the other states are not interested in doing it. There might even be less of a backlog in states that are not darker in this mapping, but also just to think about the framework that already exists and infrastructure state by state based on the percentage of clean energy that's already been adopted. And if we look at this bottom left graphic, it really highlights the variability from state to state in terms of their primary energy types, but it also highlights the conundrum between the primary energy source for those markets, as well as the price of electricity. So when we think about the price of electricity, and essentially either selling into that power market, or if you are sourcing power for your particular project, all of this has to be taken into consideration in terms of evaluating what's the best site and what states are more favorable to these types of projects. I really wanted to touch on this particular aspect, which is a hot topic in clean energy, particularly in the U.S. at the moment, which is interconnection. A couple different graphics here just highlighting the importance of understanding the impact that interconnection and transmission availability will have on your project. This graphic here of across the country shows the number of transmission projects that have projects that are looking for transmission at this point, and the backlog that's created from that. And historically, the U.S. has had trouble in terms of finding interconnection and transmission availability, which has led to a number of projects being withdrawn. It's not the only reason that these requests for interconnection have been withdrawn. There's obviously a community engagement component and other factors, including legislation that have created these outcomes, but it is a factor. And as we see down here in this graphic, the amount of transmission lines that have been built over this period has obviously dwindled over time, and there is some legislation in place, the order number 1920 in particular, that was recently introduced and approved to help alleviate this issue of a backlog of ability to get transmission out to the community. Another component of the clarification around the U.S. IRA policy is if you follow with the 45V and 45Q components, 45V focusing more on hydrogen production, 45Q focusing more on carbon capture. The clarification really changed the way that we think about colors in terms of identifying the maximum value that in terms of a tax credit that can be received based on the carbon index score of your project. So what we saw was a number of projects that fundamentally changed the financials of their project as a result of that clarification. But also, when we think of the broader context and the demand side of this discussion, it really had an impact on those demand markets that had built in that credit into their economics. And just to highlight some of the clarifications that really had an impact, we break those down into three categories. The additionality piece, if new renewables are available in the US, generally the hydrogen production is, as far as a justification for the project, versus replacing things like residential or commercial use, becomes a challenge. There's also a need for these projects to have an hourly matching requirement, which has also made it difficult for a number of green hydrogen projects to justify themselves, as well as some geographical challenges. And I just highlighted this without the contract for difference model that now countries such as Japan and Korea are considering. The cost of power, essentially, by using sourced green hydrogen as part of the overall fuel source to those power plants would rise dramatically and really encumber those economies. So it's just something else to think about in terms of your looking at the demand side of your project model. So I wanted to change the scope of my discussion to get a little bit more granular into our project. Our project is to build out, in this case, this is a conventional fuel being used in the case natural gas to produce approximately 900,000 metric tons of ammonia, and with a almost 100% carbon capture component in Port Arthur, Texas. And part of the reason that I think it's important, and I think one of the earlier presentations highlighted this, is that by going this direction in terms of how we're approaching the low carbon ammonia production, we fundamentally are not opposed to having a green technology co-located at our sites. In fact, we see that there's some complements to having both a green and blue traditional projects sourced from the same point. As was earlier mentioned, there are some advantages to having common infrastructure and some other sourcing opportunities and supply chain opportunities that these projects can be co-located. And I think fundamentally one of the areas that I encourage this group to think about is ways that we can collaborate, because if I can produce a lower cost point for hydrogen, while the long-term goal is to build up the infrastructure around supporting green hydrogen, certainly that is where we're all eventually heading. And I think that would be a welcome opportunity to collaborate on a project. I also wanted to really highlight the importance of community engagement because of the way that US-based projects operate. There's a heavy component of the local community in being engaged in the acceptance of these projects. And ironically, we do have scenarios where communities are fundamentally opposed to even renewables being put into their communities. So there's all different reasons that people have, and those can be enormous roadblocks and obstacles to the project being delivered. And I encourage you, I've included a website up here that I think is very valuable in terms of gathering resources to understand the environmental justice component portion of your project development, because it will be key. It's a requirement of the project, and you need to have a plan. And early and often engagement with the communities is certainly requirement. Building on the siting of projects, this map shows where potential sites for sequestration of CO2 are located. If you think about where hydrogen hubs are developing, a number of them overlap, assuming that projects that are both renewable based as well as projects that are based on conventional fuels are going to be sited. And in particular, our project ended up being in the Port Arthur area, primarily because of the heavy amount of infrastructure supporting CO2 sequestration in the area. Obviously, a lot of pipeline in the Gulf of Mexico and infrastructure supporting export. So as was mentioned earlier, I think Marco may have brought this up. But when you have a lot of these components overlapping in a particular area, it really just makes the likelihood of your project getting past pre-feed a lot more viable. So it's very important to understand this mapping and understand these individual factors. I included a number here at the bottom that I think are relevant to all of your projects, regardless of the fuel type. The other piece that I think is important and valuable is understanding your value chain. I think this was brought up earlier, but this is a broad array of applications and industries, and each industry has a different manner of uptake of new fuels and energy being brought into their markets. So understanding the core tenets of how they're using energy and fuels in those production processes is very important, because you don't want to spend a lot of time in doing what our president calls industrial tourism, where these companies spend a lot of energy and effort, as well as your time and effort, to understand the technology and understand the ins and outs of a project, really without understanding what the use case is going to be. So it's very fundamental to build out these value chains, and also, frankly, from the perspective of various stakeholders. So in the community, end users, off-takers, as well as the providers of your supply chain, and really going through and understanding where the gaps are in the project. And lastly, I wanted to touch on this component. As I mentioned earlier, we have a number of projects and product lines in development, and really I'd encourage you just to be open to the pathways that you could take your project. In some cases, we've had grant funding that supported the project, such as our project Cardinal, which is our calcite direct air capture technology. We've also had projects such as Broadwing, which took a fundamentally completely different pivot from what we had traditionally envisioned, as far as that project being to more of a conventional steam production and power production with carbon capture. And then, of course, our Cormorant project, which is currently in development, which is self-developed, and which is an interesting way to approach it. But in our case, that wasn't the initial expectation, but it encouraged us to go ahead and build out our project development group and engineering group to support the fulfillment of this project. So sort of be open, as Dr. Dean said earlier. I thought that was a very well way to put it, is just be ready to be flexible, be ready to pivot, because on the offtake market, as well as the pathways that your project can take, you'll have to be able to think about various ways to get to the finish line. So just some final takeaways. As far as the U.S. IRA program is concerned, certainly it is a motivator. It has accelerated a number of projects, but ultimately you still need to follow some fundamental project economics around delivering the project, that regardless of the tax incentive structure that financiers and investors will expect, that is now being priced into your project. Just understand that it still needs to stand on its own. And also the regulatory framework. So it's not just about the incentive portion of your project, but understanding the regulatory and legislative factors that can affect the delivery of your project are key to its viability. And certainly, as I mentioned before, your value chain and partnerships collaboration around projects are fundamental. So just some things to think about as you're developing your own projects. And another way to think about your development of a project in the U.S., given the IRA tax incentive program, is if you are considering a first of a kind project that may not fundamentally, because of a first of a kind or some other hurdle in another location, may not necessarily stand on its own, certainly building that first of a kind facility under the IRA structure is a very good pivot, and it's a way to essentially vet your technology and build out, eliminating some of those and minimizing some of the risks around that first of a kind development. So certainly a consideration. I want to thank you all for your time. This has been very exciting for me to put together this presentation. I think it's a different perspective, and certainly we look forward to not only networking with all of you, but the opportunity to work collaboratively. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Boriso. Your talk was truly remarkable, and I want to thank you again for all the pragmatic suggestions you brought to the industry. And here, I also have some questions for you.
Sure,
Firstly,
thank you.
Yes. Firstly, many of the narratives we've listened of the webinar consider policy as the silver bullet to address all difficult questions. As a developer benefiting from the policy boost, does policy really help projects reaching FID at a faster pace?
As far as the reaching FID, I touched on this earlier, there are still some fundamental aspects of the project that need to be built out. That although the incorporating into your financials those tax incentives is very valuable, there is even now some uncertainty around 45V specifically, that makes it a little bit difficult to leverage entirely into your project. Certainly, there's less uncertainty around the 45Q guidelines, but the 45V and a lot of the theme of conversations that are being had in the U.S. are that further clarification needs to be established in order to really encourage 45V to be taken seriously in terms of your overall financials in the project. It can help you in terms of accelerating your project delivery timeline, but also you need to take into consideration, as I mentioned earlier, that generally the offtake, if you're looking at a fuel, is going to be a long-term commitment in terms of the structure, and understanding how that window of opportunity that you have to take advantage of 45V and the tax incentive in your overall project is also important.
Yes, as the webinar titled From Vision to Action, if you can give one key recommendation of action to your industry peers, what would your message be?
I'd say that the first action is that if you haven't looked into the U.S. market as a potential avenue to establish a project, that I would encourage them to do so. The framework that's been outlined in the IRA is very advantageous at the moment from a project development side compared to developing the project elsewhere. It doesn't get you any advantage in terms of looking at offtake partners and that part of the project development, but certainly evaluating a site for a first of a kind project, or if your company's looking at their first project development, having that IRA component in your back pocket can certainly be helpful.
Yes, once again, thank you so much, Mr. Bariso, for your very kind response and your wonderful presentation. And now we come to the end. Thank you. And now we come to the end of our webinar. Once again, a big thank you to our esteemed speakers for sharing their invaluable insights, and also to our audience for your attention and participation. We'll share today's video and presentation slides on our official LinkedIn and YouTube channels next Tuesday, along with key insights from this webinar. For further inquiries, please don't hesitate to reach me out at molly@leaderassociates.com. Last but not least, I would like to remind you that this webinar serves as a virtual preview of our in-person event, Investing in Green Hydrogen in London, UK, on September the 2nd and 3rd. With only 10 days remaining for the 15% summer discount, we extend an earnest invitation for you to secure your delegate ticket. We eagerly anticipate meeting you in person and engaging in fruitful discussions that will unleash the power of hydrogen for global sustainable future. And now it really comes to the end of today's webinar. See you next time and take care.